There is a version of spirituality that becomes very good at leaving before anything can touch it. It learns how to rename distance as peace, numbness as detachment, avoidance as discernment, and withdrawal as elevation. From the outside, this can look remarkably similar to maturity because the person no longer reacts in the ways they once did. But the absence of visible disturbance does not tell you whether consciousness has expanded or whether contact with disturbance has simply been reduced. A person can become quieter because they have developed more room inside themselves, or because they have arranged their life so carefully that almost nothing reaches the places they cannot yet hold. These two states may feel identical during a peaceful morning, a solitary walk, or an undemanding meditation. Their difference appears when life refuses to cooperate with the state that has been cultivated. Peace that depends on controlled conditions reveals itself differently from peace that has learned how to remain present inside conditions it did not choose. What matters is not merely how calm you can become, but what your calm can survive without requiring you to disappear. This is one reason the language of ascension can become difficult to examine honestly. It naturally points upward, outward, beyond, toward greater freedom and wider awareness. And there is truth in that movement. Yet human beings can also use upward language to justify abandoning whatever feels heavy, unresolved, ordinary, bodily, emotional, relational, or inconvenient. When that happens, transcendence may become indistinguishable from escape, because both involve moving away from what hurts. The direction of movement alone does not tell you what consciousness is actually learning. You may have experienced this without calling it spiritual avoidance at all. Perhaps there was a period when you finally stopped arguing with someone, stopped trying to be understood, and felt enormous relief. That relief may have been wisdom because you had recognized a relationship that could no longer be repaired through continued conflict. Or it may have been exhaustion disguised as completion because part of you still needed to be seen, still carried resentment, and simply discovered that silence hurt less than engagement. The same outward behavior can arise from entirely different inner conditions. This is why consciousness cannot be measured only by appearance. Two people may both walk away from an argument, yet one leaves because they can feel anger without allowing anger to decide what happens next, while the other leaves because anger has become intolerable to feel at all. Two people may both forgive, yet one has metabolized the injury while the other has rushed into forgiveness, because remaining angry feels spiritually unacceptable. Two people may both say that something no longer matters, yet only one of them can return to the subject without tightening, defending, or collapsing. What has been transcended does not usually require constant protection from being encountered again. The body often knows this before the spiritual identity does. A person may sincerely believe that they have released an experience while their chest contracts whenever a certain name appears on a screen. They may speak beautifully about non-attachment while avoiding places, conversations, memories, and people that might reactivate what supposedly no longer holds them. This does not make their spiritual understanding false, but it may reveal that understanding has moved farther than embodiment. Consciousness can comprehend a truth before the nervous system has learned how to live inside it. That gap matters, because insight is easy to mistake for integration. You can understand why someone hurt you and still carry the wound. You can recognize that anger is temporary and still be frightened of your own anger. You can know that identity is larger than grief and still wake in the middle of the night reaching for someone who is gone. Greater awareness does not erase these reactions merely because it can describe them accurately. There is a subtle temptation here. especially for people who have experienced genuine spiritual openings. Once you have known yourself as something larger than a single emotion, role, body, conflict, or story, ordinary human reactions can begin to feel strangely small. You may start treating them as evidence that you have fallen from a state you were supposed to maintain. Then the spiritual path becomes organized around getting back above the human experience whenever the human experience becomes inconvenient. Instead of expanding your capacity to include more of yourself, spirituality begins teaching you which parts of yourself must not be allowed into the room. This can happen with anger more easily than many people admit. Anger is often classified as lower, reactive, dense, or spiritually immature, because it can certainly become destructive when it is unconscious. But there is a difference between being governed by anger and being capable of meeting anger directly. If your peace requires that anger never arise, then anger still possesses enormous power over you because your entire inner arrangement depends upon its absence. Freedom from anger is not necessarily the inability to feel it. Sometimes freedom is the ability to let anger enter awareness without handing it the keys. The same distinction appears with grief. Some people discover a wider understanding of death, continuity, consciousness, or impermanence, and then expect that understanding to cancel the pain of losing someone particular. But grief is not always a philosophical misunderstanding that greater knowledge should remove. Sometimes grief is what love feels like when the form through which love was expressed is no longer available. If consciousness becomes larger, it may become capable of holding both the wider understanding and the unbearable particularity of missing one voice, one face, one ordinary presence at the table. That is more difficult than replacing grief with an explanation. Explanations can be compassionate and true, but they can also become exits when used too quickly. You can tell yourself that everything happens for a reason before you have allowed yourself to admit that something devastated you. You can say that the soul continues before acknowledging how much you wanted this person to remain here in this body, in this life, beside you. Sometimes the higher perspective becomes truly higher only when it has enough room to contain the lower floor rather than pretending the lower floor is no longer part of the building. There is also an escapism that hides inside the desire to remain positive. A person may become so committed to maintaining a particular vibration, emotional atmosphere, or state of consciousness that reality itself begins to feel like an intrusion. Difficult conversations are avoided because they lower the energy. News is ignored because it is too dense. People in pain are subtly judged for focusing on what they should be transcending, and personal responsibility can be dismissed as attachment to an old paradigm. What began as sensitivity can slowly become a system for ensuring that consciousness encounters only what confirms its preferred state. But consciousness that is genuinely expanding becomes capable of more contact, not merely more pleasant contact. Its range increases. It can stand near grief without needing to fix it immediately, hear anger without becoming anger, encounter disagreement without interpreting disagreement as contamination, and remain aware inside uncertainty without demanding a spiritual explanation before it can proceed. Expansion does not always feel like rising because sometimes the larger movement is an increased ability to stay. You discover that spaciousness is not distance from experience, but room enough for experience to occur without becoming the totality of who you are. This changes how you understand being triggered. A trigger does not automatically prove that you have failed to heal, descended in vibration, or returned to an earlier version of yourself. Sometimes a trigger reveals the exact place where your present capacity is meeting unfinished material. The question is not simply whether disturbance appeared, but what becomes possible after it appears. Can you remain in contact with yourself while the old response is moving through you, or must you immediately escape into explanation, blame, shutdown, spiritualization, or distance? There are moments when leaving is still the most conscious action available. No teaching about presence requires you to remain in abuse, danger, manipulation, or environments that repeatedly violate your well-being. Capacity is not proven by how much harm you can tolerate. And spiritual maturity is not endurance performed for the sake of appearing evolved. Sometimes the clearest expression of consciousness is the refusal to remain where your humanity is continually diminished. The distinction lies in whether you are leaving because reality has been seen clearly or because seeing reality clearly would require you to feel something you have not yet learned to hold. That distinction cannot always be made immediately. Human motives are layered, and you may leave a situation for both wise and avoidant reasons at once. You may protect yourself correctly while still carrying anger you have not understood. End a relationship that needed to end while still using spiritual language to avoid mourning it, or create distance from chaos while quietly becoming dependent on distance itself. Consciousness does not become less mature because mixed motives exist. Maturity begins when you can see those motives without forcing them into a cleaner story than the truth provides. This is where embodiment becomes more demanding than belief. A belief can remain perfect because it does not have to stand in a kitchen with a person who knows exactly where you are still defensive. A philosophy can feel complete until money becomes uncertain, someone you love disappoints you, your body becomes exhausted, or an old wound is touched in a way meditation never touched it. Life keeps bringing consciousness into contact with the places where its theories have not yet become capacity, not to punish you, but because reality reveals what solitude can conceal. You may feel deeply expanded while alone and surprisingly ordinary when someone misunderstands you. You may experience profound unity in meditation and become irritated 5 minutes later when another driver cuts you off. That contrast is not hypocrisy, unless you pretend it is not happening. It is information about where consciousness is wide in one environment and narrow in another. The path becomes more honest when these contractions are not treated as disqualifications, but as locations where awareness has not yet learned to remain open under pressure. Pressure is important because almost every state looks stable before something presses against it. Patience seems effortless when nothing delays you. Compassion seems natural around people who do not threaten your identity. Non-attachment appears complete while the thing you care about remains secure. The fire reveals whether these qualities are conditions you enjoy or capacities you have begun to embody. And yet even this can become another spiritual contest if handled carelessly. You can start seeking difficulty to prove your strength, glorifying suffering because you believe the fire makes you more conscious, or remaining in unnecessary pain because leaving would feel like failure. That is only another form of identity trying to become spiritually impressive. The point is not to worship intensity, but to notice what happens when intensity inevitably arrives. You do not need to manufacture the fire, because being human will eventually provide enough of it. The deeper question is what the fire is allowed to reveal. When fear appears, do you instantly interpret fear as evidence that you are misaligned, or can you listen long enough to discover what fear is protecting? When jealousy appears, must you condemn it as unevolved, or can you examine the insecurity, attachment, comparison, or longing beneath it without allowing jealousy to govern your behavior? When grief appears, must it be converted into gratitude before it is finished speaking? Presence becomes spacious precisely because it no longer requires every uncomfortable experience to become something else before it is permitted to exist. This may change the meaning of ascension entirely. Perhaps rising does not mean becoming less human, less emotional, less affected, or less entangled with the complexity of embodied life. Perhaps what rises is the amount of awareness available inside the human experience itself. You still feel, but more of you is present while feeling. You still enter uncertainty, conflict, attachment, and loss. But fewer parts of yourself need to vanish in order for you to survive being there. Then the person who appears least disturbed is not automatically the most expanded person in the room. It may be the person who can remain kind while genuinely angry, honest while afraid, connected while grieving, and inwardly coherent while reality refuses to become simple. Their light is not proven by avoiding the fire, but by no longer requiring the fire to go out before they can remember who they are. They do not become invulnerable. They become increasingly capable of remaining present without surrendering themselves to whatever is passing through them. And that is a very different kind of ascent from merely learning how to lead. The danger now is that you may take everything just said and build a new test for yourself. You may decide that the more conscious person is simply the one who can remain present through greater discomfort, greater conflict, greater grief, greater pressure, and greater uncertainty. That sounds more grounded than escape, and often it is. But endurance can become another disguise, and a person can remain in the fire for reasons that have very little to do with expanded consciousness. Some people have been trained by life to tolerate extraordinary amounts of difficulty. They learned early that leaving was not available, that asking for relief changed nothing, that love required adaptation, or that safety depended on becoming extremely skilled at staying functional while suffering. Such a person may appear remarkably composed inside conflict, because conflict is familiar territory. Their ability to stay does not automatically mean consciousness has widened. Sometimes it means their threshold for recognizing harm has been distorted by repetition. This complicates the idea that presence can be measured by what you can withstand. A nervous system can become accustomed to chaos without becoming free from it. Someone may remain calm during hostility because hostility resembles home, while genuine tenderness makes them uncomfortable because tenderness asks them to receive rather than survive. Another person may endure an unhealthy relationship for years and call their endurance spiritual patience. Remaining is not always courage, just as leaving is not always escape. So the question cannot simply be whether you stay or whether you go. It cannot even be whether you feel peaceful while doing either one. Consciousness is more difficult to measure because almost every behavior can be produced by very different inner mechanisms. Withdrawal can come from wisdom or fear. Endurance can come from capacity or conditioning. Silence can come from spaciousness or suppression. And confrontation can come from truth or wounded identity. Behavior provides clues, but rarely a complete answer. This is uncomfortable because the spiritual mind wants a reliable map. It wants to know which direction is higher, which response is more evolved, which emotion is evidence of growth, and which choice proves that awakening is occurring. Rules provide relief from ambiguity because they allow the self to evaluate itself. Yet the deeper you go, the fewer actions remain spiritually pure simply because of their appearance. Consciousness seems interested in giving you a perfect set of behaviors than in revealing what is actually moving beneath them. You can see this most clearly in the person who has learned to endure beautifully. They remain gentle while others disrespect them, patient while their needs are ignored, forgiving while the same injury is repeated, and spiritually composed while resentment accumulates underneath. They may believe they are practicing unconditional love because they rarely retaliate. But sometimes what looks like unconditional love is fear of becoming inconvenient enough to risk being abandoned. There are people who call themselves peaceful because they have never permitted themselves to become dangerous enough to establish a boundary. They do not know whether they have transcended anger because they have never truly allowed anger to complete its message. They have learned that being good means being easy to live with, easy to disappoint, easy to interrupt, and easy to ask more from. Spiritual language can enter that structure and sanctify it. What was once self-erasure becomes surrender, compassion, acceptance, or service. Then even the teaching that you should remain present inside discomfort can reinforce the wound. The person who already stays too long hears, "Do not run from the fire," and interprets it as another instruction to endure. The person who already distrusts their own limits hears, "Expand your capacity," and assumes every limit is something to overcome. They may become more skillful at containing pain while becoming less able to recognize when pain is asking for change. A teaching about presence becomes dangerous when it forgets that presence includes being present to the impulse to leave. Sometimes growth is the moment you finally become unable to tolerate what you once called normal. Your consciousness expands, and instead of becoming more serene inside an old situation, you become more disturbed by it. What you previously accepted begins to feel intolerable because you can now perceive the cost more clearly. This can look like regression from the outside: more anger, less patience, more conflict, firmer boundaries, fewer spiritual explanations. Yet the disturbance may be evidence that numbness is wearing off. That possibility overturns another easy assumption. Greater consciousness does not always make you calmer. Sometimes it makes you more responsive because you can finally feel what you had to suppress in order to survive. The first phase of becoming more present may therefore feel less peaceful than the state that came before it. You are not necessarily becoming more reactive. You may simply be recovering access to reactions that have been buried beneath adaptation. This is why awakening can make a life temporarily messier. Relationships that depended on your silence begin to strain when you speak. Roles that depended on your self-sacrifice become unstable when you ask whether they are still yours to carry. People who experienced your lack of boundaries as kindness may experience your boundaries as rejection. The old arrangement may call your change selfish because your former version was useful to it. There is no guarantee that spiritual growth will be socially rewarded. Sometimes the person becoming more conscious becomes easier to love because they are less defensive and more available. Sometimes they become harder to manipulate, harder to shame, harder to keep inside roles they did not consciously choose, and harder to recruit into maintaining someone else's denial. That may not feel peaceful to everyone around them. Harmony is not always evidence of coherence. Sometimes harmony exists because one person has been absorbing the conflict for everyone else. This creates a second problem, because once you recognize this, you can make disruption itself into another spiritual badge. You can begin imagining that every conflict proves you are finally authentic, that everyone who resists your behavior is threatened by your growth, and that being misunderstood confirms your awakening. Spiritual ego adapts quickly. If serenity becomes suspect, it can become proud of turbulence instead. A person can weaponize authenticity just as easily as they once weaponized peace. They can say, "I am speaking my truth," while refusing to examine whether cruelty has entered the truth they are speaking. They can call every boundary sacred while using boundaries to punish. They can describe accountability as low vibration because it challenges the version of themselves they now identify as liberated. Escapism does not always retreat into silence. Sometimes it escapes into certainty. This matters because spiritual identity is extremely capable of reorganizing itself around whatever teaching threatens it. Tell the ego that detachment is advanced, and it will become detached. Tell it that embodiment is advanced, and it will become aggressively embodied. Tell it that anger must be honored, and it may begin treating every impulse as revelation. Tell it that nothing should be spiritually bypassed, and it may turn endless emotional excavation into a new way of avoiding ordinary life. The problem was never the vocabulary. The problem was the use of consciousness to protect identity from contact with something it does not want to know. That protection can look elevated or wounded, peaceful or furious, withdrawn or confrontational. It can happen while meditating in silence or while passionately declaring that silence is avoidance. The form changes more easily than the mechanism beneath it. This is where the teaching becomes less comfortable because there may be no outward posture that proves you are not escaping. You can escape through leaving, through staying, through acceptance, through resistance, through transcendence, through embodiment, through silence, through confrontation, even through healing itself. Anything can become avoidance when it is used to prevent a deeper contact. The question slowly shifts from "what should I do?" to "what am I unwilling to encounter through what I am doing?" Sometimes what you are unwilling to encounter is grief. Sometimes it is responsibility. Sometimes it is the possibility that another person may have understood something about you that you did not want to admit. Sometimes it is the possibility that you are right but still cannot control the outcome. And sometimes the thing you are avoiding is far simpler: the ordinary vulnerability of wanting something without knowing whether you will receive it. Spiritual systems often become attractive precisely because they can offer language large enough to place vulnerability inside a greater pattern. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. A larger context can keep pain from becoming meaningless and can help consciousness remain open when immediate circumstances seem unbearable. But the larger context becomes evasive when it removes the requirement to meet the smaller truth. You can believe that relationships are mirrors and still need to admit that someone betrayed you. You can believe that every encounter contributes to growth and still acknowledge that you wish a particular encounter had never happened. You can believe consciousness continues beyond death and still hate the empty chair. A wider perspective does not become more spiritual by contradicting the human truth beneath it. Its maturity is revealed by whether both truths can remain present without one being recruited to erase the other. This is where grounded light begins to mean something more difficult than remaining calm inside the fire. Grounded light is not merely the ability to preserve your center while experience intensifies. It is the willingness to allow reality to alter your understanding of what your center actually contains. Sometimes the fire does not test the truth you already possess. Sometimes it reveals that what you call truth was partly an arrangement built to keep certain experiences outside. You may enter difficulty believing your task is to remain loving and discover that love requires refusal. You may enter believing your task is to establish a boundary and discover that your boundary was protecting pride more than well-being. You may enter believing forgiveness is the highest response and discover that you have not yet told the truth about what happened. You may enter believing confrontation is necessary and realize that the deeper strength is allowing someone to misunderstand you without constructing a final battle around it. There is no fixed spiritual personality waiting at the end of this. Consciousness does not necessarily turn everyone into the same calm, soft-spoken, endlessly patient human being, nor does embodiment turn everyone into fierce boundary setters who constantly announce what they will no longer tolerate. Expansion increases the ability to respond from contact rather than compulsion. That may produce gentleness in one moment and firmness in another. Silence here and speech there. Surrender once and refusal the next time. This makes the path harder to perform because it removes many of the visible signs by which people recognize themselves as spiritual. You may not always look awakened. You may cry harder than you once did because you are no longer ashamed of grief, become angry more cleanly because you no longer need anger to become hatred, apologize more quickly because protecting your image matters less, and leave situations earlier because you no longer confuse endurance with love. At another time, you may stay where the old version of you would have fled because discomfort no longer automatically means danger. The common thread is not behavior, but increasing honesty of contact. You are less dependent on converting the moment into a story that preserves who you believe yourself to be. You can discover that you were avoiding and remain present to the embarrassment of that discovery. You can realize that something you called intuition was fear, or that something you dismissed as fear was intuition, without needing the previous interpretation to remain sacred. Expansion includes the capacity to be corrected by your own experience. This may be one of the least glamorous forms of awakening, because it does not always provide the emotional reward of feeling advanced. It can remove certainty faster than it replaces it. You become more capable of seeing how many motives can coexist inside a single choice, how love can contain fear, how courage can contain pride, how surrender can contain exhaustion, and how even genuine insight can be used defensively later. Complexity stops feeling like evidence that you are doing something wrong. And still, there is another destabilization hidden inside all of this. If consciousness becomes more capable of holding complexity, you may begin believing complexity itself is superior to clarity. You may become so suspicious of certainty that you refuse to commit to anything, endlessly inspecting every motive while life waits for you to move. Awareness can become fascinated with its own nuance. The refusal to simplify can become another way of refusing responsibility for choosing. There are moments when you will never know whether every part of you is ready. There are relationships you may need to leave while still loving the person, truths you may need to speak while still doubting your wording, and decisions you may need to make without receiving a clean spiritual confirmation. Presence does not promise perfect internal agreement before action. Sometimes consciousness must move while contradiction remains alive inside it. This is where the fire becomes less like a place of suffering and more like a place where false simplicity cannot survive. You cannot always divide your experience neatly into ascension and escapism, courage and avoidance, intuition and fear, staying and leaving. You may be expanding in one layer while escaping in another. The work is not to become pure enough that mixed motives disappear, but conscious enough that mixed motives no longer have to hide. Then ascension begins to lose its resemblance to upward movement altogether. What grows is not distance from human life, but intimacy with what is actually happening inside it. You become harder to deceive with your own spiritual language, but also less interested in condemning yourself when deception is discovered. You become capable of carrying light into the fire because light no longer means remaining untouched by what the fire reveals. It means becoming willing to see what is there, even when what is there changes the person you thought awakening was supposed to make you.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.